The first time I was introduced not to two-dimensional chronovision, but third and fourth dimensional chronovision, initially was at the General Manufacturing Company facility, where I was immersed in the hologram, and I found myself walking along this grassy swale. And I thought there was a rugby game, or maybe a soccer match going, or football match going around or in the field around the bend of trees. And I looked to my left, and I saw a woman in beautiful 1800s period clothing, you know, this very elaborate dress. There was an old man with a cane standing behind her, and a boy kind of standing to her right. So I thought, okay, I see some spectators, and I'm actually walking in the hologram now. One of the paradoxes of chronovision is when, even though it's opened up on a fourth dimensional basis inside the room, when you're in the hologram, it opens up a fifth dimensional experience of that realm. That's a true quantum paradox. I mean, if I had just been in a virtual reality simulation, if I walked through that virtual reality, just a holographic virtual reality, I'd smack my face against the wall, right? But when we were inside these holograms that they were generating with this device, it's like we were there in real time. So if we were in a field, we could walk as far as the field, the whole field, and we didn't hit our face against the wall of the laboratory. And that was astonishing. It was like a window to a cubical three-dimensional or fourth-dimensional reality. And so I got around the trees there. I walked around the bend, and I was startled by the fact that it wasn't a football game. It was a Civil War battle, and it was coming towards me. The Confederate forces were in this particular skirmish or battle, were overtaking the Union forces in blue, and a Union soldier with a big mustache. It could very well have been Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, the hero of Gettysburg, but somebody who looked very much like Chamberlain, who was a sergeant, I could see his chevron, pulled his saber out of its holster or scabbard, whatever, and waving it in the air said, boy, get off this battlefield. You're going to be killed, lad. Move, go. And that evidenced what we had been told by Jack Pruitt when he trained us on the chronovisor at Convent Station in Morristown, New Jersey, which is that we could see and be seen in these propagated holograms of past events or future events, but he told us during our training that we were only a spectral presence in their reality, like ghosts are in ours. That's a direct quote. So he said, no harm can come to you. You will only be in for short periods of time. And if, for example, you confront a Viking warrior and he tries to pass some big sword through your midsection, you're not going to be harmed. If we send you to the time of the dinosaurs and the dinosaur steps on you, all you're going to see is a shadow, and then it'll lift, and you'll see the dinosaur walking past you. You will not be injured. The problem is, though, as I began actively traveling initially to the past, I only had a few trips to the future, but I had many trips to the past when the chronovisor was moved to Morristown, New Jersey, because two boys had come in on their Stingray bicycles into the location there in Convent Station. And I became concerned that they either didn't know what was going on in the project or they were lying to us. Because how is it, for example, that when I was chronovised to Holland in 1800, this Dutch farm woman helped me, pulled me out of an irrigation ditch, took me inside of her house and served me soup. And I looked down and the soup hadn't poured through my viscera to the floor like it might in a Hollywood rendering of my experiences for effect. I drank it. It stayed in my stomach. So I also remember, like when they sent me to the Five Points neighborhood of New York City around 2005, I was there for 3 days and 2 nights. I slept with about 10 people on the same mattress. Okay, this tenement was squalid. There was this one Irish lady who was always looking at me saying, because I told her where I was from, she said, oh, you're from New Jersey from 1971, huh? Oh, you're a little stinker, that's what you are. So I love that woman. Whoever's grandmother or great-grandmother, that woman kept me alive for 3 days. Maybe she's reincarnated. She's a friend in my contemporary life. So I had this Irish lady who was feeding me and about 9 other boys. And there were 2 adults coming home in the evening, which were like guys in their 20s who were factory workers who were utterly exhausted. So if people could see, for example, how squalid conditions were even in some of our cities around 1900, imagine how they would appreciate a location as beautiful as this. A hygienic bathroom, a warm, safe place to get a good night's sleep. I mean, we take these things for granted, but in that instance, I was literally praying that they would extract me. Now, how did they extract us? if we were in for 15 minutes or fewer, the hologram would start collapsing, and the other kids in the probe would start coming in as black body emanations. And the hologram would fade in a field of supercharged particles called scintillation. Several years ago, I met with Dr. John Peters, who is holding 60 residual patents of Dr. Ivan Browning, who, as I mentioned, was Director of Science and Technology for CIA during these years. And I said, well, I'm not a physicist, John. You tell me whether scintillation is a technical term that's germane to what I'm describing. And at lunch up in Vancouver, Washington, he said, well, I can tell you that, yes, scintillation does describe the performance of certain particles of light in certain supercharged situations. Okay, so that's what we were sitting in. We were sitting in this field of shimmering light for about 90 seconds. Jack Pruitt had actually encouraged us to sit down and count down from 100 as the scintillation cleared. If the hologram did not collapse after 15 minutes of being inside it, they were sticking this soccer goal-like contraption that indicated a portal that they were inserting into the hologram. And we were instructed to run towards that. In fact, we had training exercises on this up at a local New Jersey Army base. And that indicated that we could run back to the present because we would run towards that soccer goal and through it. And we would find ourselves running through a tunnel covered with sand in the back of a defunct New Jersey amusement park. And even though they told us when you get halfway through that amusement park tunnel, you're back in 1971, 72, whatever, there was a metal Tyrannosaurus Rex statue right at the mouth of the cave of this ride. And we'd actually knock on it 3 times superstitiously to really tell ourselves that we were back in terra quanta. Okay, we were back in the present because we knew we had been displaced into the past. The greatest distance that I went was to Arizona during the time of vegetarian dinosaurs, non-carnivorous dinosaurs, which I've now investigated and found out it wasn't 1 million years ago, it was 100 million years ago. I found myself during the first probe from Morristown, New Jersey, walking along this red crest line for about 10 minutes, very hot and swelteringly humid, and I looked over on the right and I saw 2 big long-necked dinosaurs chomping on some tall grass. Very kind of Jurassic Park and immense. So one of the things they trained us to do is pretty much just control our emotion, because sometimes when we were time traveling, we were being overwhelmed by what we were seeing. So they did go to the very distant past. The primary thing I did in chronovision occurred during that first half of that summer of 71, before they had my dad investigating my future, because I was destined to be the principal whistleblower. And that was the probes to the Lincoln assassination site that I mentioned. And that clearly proved the existence of the multiverse, because every time they took a slice of the quantum hologram with the chronovisor, I experienced a different event. I mean, Abraham Lincoln and his wife still arrived. Our American Cousin, starring Laura Keene, was still being performed at Ford's Theater that night of April 14th, 1865. But small changes would occur, like I would go to the ticket desk and try to talk my way past the ticket desk. I was dressed kind of in this Little Lord Fauntleroy finery of a society kid of that era in Washington, kind of embarrassed at how effeminate it was versus the Union Bugle Boy costume that I would be furnished or had been furnished. And I would walk through the lobby and the same person would pass by, but maybe the second time talking to somebody else. Or the people at the ticket desk would be, a boy and a man, but the next time it would be the man and the boy, and they were in different positions. In other words, the same fundamental momentous event occurred that night of President Lincoln being shot by somebody, and all of the ruckus, what play was being performed that night. But the tiny little details of my own experience always changed every time the chronovisor tuned in a past event. And this is how I think that we can understand the difference between immediately adjacent timelines. Big events that change the nature of the quantum hologram are deeply embedded, and hence they occur in multiple adjacent timelines. But the small details are susceptible to our own motive experience with reality. Like, think about the fact that you go into your kitchen your radio's always there, right? Because a radio is a pretty sophisticated device. What do you know? It's always sitting there in your kitchen ready to be turned on. But when you turn your radio on, you can listen to jazz, classical, country, and change those sort of small interstitial details in your experience. That is how I believe the timelines relate to each other, because that was happening every time they sent me via Chronovision. There was a one-off Chronovision probe to the future that took place at the ITT Defense Communications Facility in Nutley, New Jersey, and I know the exact date because we were being groomed in or trained in September and October of 1971 for that first Friday in November, which was November 5th of 1971. We were taken up to ITT Defense. Instead of a couple technicians in the room and a rudimentary chronovisor, there was this huge chronovisor and stanchions that we were going to be roped to with these belts. We were wearing titanium-coated jumpsuits and crystal helmets because when they turned the device on, we had like a 30-minute journey through time-space where there were then 3 pulses and we were brought down hovering over a building. We were then pulled back. I could tell that the building was under about 100 feet of brackish water. I was disrobed on the stage there and poured out my boots. To this day, I don't know whether it was the water and my boots had leaked or it was perspiration, because that crystal array was exceptionally hot. We're going to look at why children were involved in Project Pegasus. I mentioned that I was part of a cadre of 150 gifted and talented American school children, mostly concentrated in the eastern half of the continental United States, because of course we were teleporting into New Mexico. There were really 4 major reasons of why children were involved in activities that were so new, dangerous, and experimental, literally on the threshold of time travel research and development. These are all gleaned from what I was told when I was being trained, and also discussions that I held with my father in the late 1980s before his death in 1990, where we were sort of having a series of heart-to-hearts about what we were involved in. My dad wanted me to talk not just to the family, but the world, because, as he said shortly before his death, you know, son, when my toes curl up, I want you to convene a family meeting and tell the family everything. And then I want you to tell the entire world. And I asked him, why Dad? You know, these activities were supposed to remain secret. And he said, because we were part of something great. So of course my dad recognized that we had had the cosmic privilege of being involved in time travel at the time of its emergence, and that the whole world should know. So in a sense, I'm carrying on his legacy by sustaining my truth campaign. The first reason that children were involved, it clearly is that we were experimentees. They were testing the physical and mental effects of teleportation on bright, sturdy American kids who would possess some of the personal traits, let's say, of the children of our executive branch officials, the president, the vice president, and other U.S. Government officials who would find themselves teleporting. So I described how when we arrived in Santa Fe, we would be bused up to the old school site in Lamy. That property is now owned as a private residence of a family. But, and there we would be medically examined by a nurse, and we would take part in about 2.5 hours of standardized testing and then be fed lunch. So they were just gathering baseline information, experimenting with us to see how children would cope with teleportation. And my dad, as a brilliant mathematician, most of what he did at the Edison Labs from 1956 to 64 was solve high-end math problems regarding the electronic components that were in development there in New Jersey. New Jersey was sort of the Silicon Valley of the 1950s and early 60s. And my dad essentially earned a living for his family of 5 children as a mathematician in the late 50s and early 60s. And he was proud that in terms of all the math problems that were thrown at me, I missed one, and it was an algebra problem that I hadn't gotten to yet in my schooling. So I was bucking up fairly well teleporting. In other words, while sometimes I sort of smelled ozone and had a kind of a rush of body temperature, a sensation of bodily heat when we popped into view in Santa Fe or back in New Jersey, I was pretty much mentally cognizant and not confused, and I apparently did well in the math and the verbal component of that SAT type problem set that was always thrown at us upon arriving, certainly regularly in the summer of '70. We were also what I call necessities, and that is to say that chronovision was still under development, and when a large human being, an adult, was placed on the stage and the chronovisor brought into view around them, it was frequently going on the blink. In other words, a large human being, that is to say an adult, was preventing the hologram from remaining stable. So even when I was brought into the chronovision activities in fall of '70, they were still trying to stabilize the holograms, and hence they decided to use a cadre of children that were bright enough to be trained and had personalities where they would be cooperative enough to basically be participant observers within the holograms. There was such a sensitivity to the holograms that I remember when we first went into the chronovisor location in Morristown, one of the team leaders asked one of the technicians whether what we were looking at, which showed a scene of a castle in England, this beautiful picturesque Tudor castle, and a groundskeeper was sort of walking a beautiful horse diagonally across the scene in front of the castle. And she asked, is that the groundskeeper of the castle? And just her voice disturbed the hologram, and the technician looked back and scowled at her. So they needed small, cooperative, intelligent human beings who they could use as participant observers inside the holograms generated by the chronovisors. We also were viewees, which is just a word that I've made up to express being a participant observer. Children are deemed to be tabula rasa, or blank slates. They tend to be more reliable percipients because, as we know, with the keen perception of children, they tend to see things as they are rather than as altered by the selection bias of their previous experience. I don't know what this is, not secure that is. And so they, as participant observers in the different time travel experiences we had, they wanted children because we were deemed to be more keenly perceptive and accurate in our perceptions. So for example, you go to some location where a man was wearing a holster, an adult would see a gun in the holster, but a child would see, let's say, some kind of scientific instrument in the holster because they weren't overlaying the bias of their previous life experience. And there were many times when that was verified where we were actually standing by our position as to what we had seen in a certain time-space location that we were sent to because we were kids and we had seen it accurately. And then finally, we were trainees, and we were told that some of us would go on and serve in the U.S. time-space program as adults, as the chrononauts of the future, as it were, in a secret time-space program that would parallel the public space program. And we know, in terms of the Gary McKinnon case, that Gary has not been extradited to the United States because he entered the computer files of the U.S. Defense Department, but while there actually detected the presence of U.S. Navy ships in space. So in a sense, Gary McKinnon is now a political prisoner in terms of the concealment of some of the very technologies that I'm talking about. In fact, I may have been on one of those Navy ships in space if I hadn't refused to become enrolled in the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis. I actually stood up my local congressman as a high school student in the late 1970s. It was Barry Goldwater Jr. A meeting had been scheduled for them to just grease the skids and admit me to the Naval Academy because, as Donald Rumsfeld had said to my father when we were back on the project in the early 70s, the plan is to drop the kids into the Naval Academy and use that as a pretext for future project experiences. So I've called publicly for the pardon of Gary McKinnon and his release to the United Kingdom. He has Asperger's syndrome. He was not really at fault, and in fact, he has served the public well by bringing attention to the existence of a secret U.S. Navy fleet in the near-Earth environment. As I said, I believe that that's in fact one of the functions that I may have literally found myself serving in. And then just kind of a fifth reason, I don't have a screen regarding it, but in one of the latter discussions with my dad, he said, you know, and also I have to be honest, son, a lot of the adults we were working with were ultimately going insane. You can usually train an adult, but very easily, obviously, a child, to become, let's say, a scuba diver, where the individual is moving effortlessly between, as Jacques Cousteau used to observe, you know, sort of the joy of moving between the terrestrial and the aquatic environment and then returning to the terrestrial environment, which many people here tonight are going to be experiencing tomorrow. We do the same thing when we move between timelines, or between quantum environments, if you will, but it's not a natural function like being an aquatic human being is. I mean, Buckminster Fuller believed that we evolved in lagoons in the South Pacific, but certainly we didn't evolve moving between timelines in the quantum hologram. And so they were finding that when they trained, for example, adult Navy enlisted personnel, even in their 20s, they would send them on a time travel assignment to a non-local place, and they would come back and they would then sort of fall apart psychiatrically because they couldn't cope with the notion that our particular location in time space is rather arbitrary and tenuous, and a kind of an existential neuroses developed, and some of the adult time travelers really had mental breakdowns. So kind of a fifth goal in the area of being trainees was to work with us from childhood to mentally equip us to move between timelines as adults when our other services on behalf of the Defense Department would be necessary, spying, etc. So those were the 4.5 major reasons why we were involved. There was no mysticism about it. They needed us for programmatic reasons, and so our services we were conscripted into this defense project. I was supposed to have been paid $30,000 US to be paid in trust and be released to me on my 25th birthday on September 18th of 1986. But when my dad and I drove down to the Army Adjutant's office at Curtis Wright for him to sign the trust documents, what ensued was about an hour argument between my dad and the Army Adjutant because they had decided not to pay my compensation because they had learned that I was going to try to quote-unquote sabotage the program that I grew up. Now, if you think about this whole issue of quantum entanglement and quantum reflexivity, by not paying me my service pay, they made me, or at least they partially motivated me to become the whistleblower I became, for which they then decided not to pay me in real time. So you have to remember that relating between the present and the future is kind of like when you go into a barber shop and you have the right side of the barbershop mirror reflecting the left side, which is reflecting the right side, and so forth into infinity. They clearly made the stupid decision. They should have paid me because I would have been less bitter and less committed of a whistleblower and figure in the evolving truth movement. I must add, I started to talk about this, but my father's longtime friend Connie Chavez once sort of spoke with me at poolside in Albuquerque about what I was presently going to be doing. And it was Connie who described the truth movement as a major social and political movement in the United States. So she said, yes, Andrew, you're going to be a major figure in this social movement that emerges and talking about many of the things that you've been experiencing in the project. So I kind of look at the truth movement as the metaphysical evolution of the abolition movement. During the Civil War and prior, there was an international movement that began in England with the emancipation of British slaves or opposition to slavery in 1822, and then of course we had Lincoln enacting pretty much just issuing the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1st of 1863. So the Civil War period, the abolition movement was about liberating human beings from physical bondage. And I kind of interpret the truth movement as significant a movement ultimately that will be liberating humanity from metaphysical bondage. Because we remain in metaphysical bondage as long as, for example, the leading applications in quantum physics that our grandfather's generation developed remain state secrets rather than public truths. And so that's why I'm speaking out. So Those were where the kids were involved. I speak of this fourth section as the findings, and by this I mean, by 1972, what had they found about the future? Well, I only know what I know. I don't know what I don't know, and I also don't know what I don't know. So, to paraphrase Don Rumsfeld, although I think he stole that from me from my book when they read it in the early 70s in New Mexico, but I can only speak about what I overheard. What I overheard were the following future events were known to the project by no later than 1972. They knew about the impending resignation of Richard Nixon before the Watergate controversy fomented. The reason I know that is I went behind two gentlemen at a bar I was present at bars, I wasn't drinking, I was being served grape knee-highs all the time, like Radar O'Reilly. And people say, oh, your dad was taking you into bars and you were drinking? No, I was drinking grape soda. But at one bar, I walked behind two CIA guys, and then one of them said to the other, and this was long before Watergate became a controversy, and he said, it looks like Nixon gets ensnared in a controversy called Watergate and is forced to resign the presidency. And the other guy looked at him and took a puff on his cigarette and went, oh, Christ. Because, of course, these were Nixon Republicans who had been through the controversy of the Vietnam War, the shootings at Kent State in 1970, the My Lai massacre investigation in 71, 72, and so forth. And now they're seeing that their guy was going to be driven from office for his personal dishonesty and paranoia primarily, but also politically. So this part of the intelligence community, the defense technical community, had prior knowledge of Watergate. If you go back to the Watergate literature, there seems to be a lot of intentionality about, let's say, Woodward and Bernstein's involvement, who Deep Throat really was. So I think who Deep Throat might have been is some source within the CIA who was actually toppling Nixon because they knew he was going to be toppled. That's my own personal theory. I don't think it was Mark Felt. I think it was probably Project Pegasus working through Alexander Haig or something like that. But I have my own theories on Watergate. But they did have prior knowledge of President Nixon's resignation on August 9th of 1974. At least 2 years in advance, I would say. They also knew about later 20, 25, 30 years in the future of, well, actually not that long, more like 10 years in the future, of the emergence of AIDS as an epidemic disease. They were observing human behavior in the chronovisors. They weren't just studying famous events or persons of interest. Sometimes they were just scanning society and they were trying to make conclusions based on people's behavior. And I remember Connie saying one time, well, Ray, isn't there some kind of disease that emerges and you have sex with somebody and you can die? So I didn't hear the term HIV or AIDS used, but they were aware of the emergence of a sexually transmitted disease that can be lethal and can also be transmitted non-sexually. So AIDS wasn't discussed, but the phenomenon was known by no later than 1971 to that faction within CIA that my father was part of. They also knew about the advent of the internet. I mentioned the anecdote regarding John Alexander McCone describing the internet and then having my father go, how do we know what .com means? Maybe it means the commies have taken over by then. So they knew about the advent of the internet. They also knew about widespread cell phone use. When I asked my dad in the late 80s, what else did you find out about the future? He said, well, we know mobile phones are going to come into commonplace everyday use because we looked into the future and we all saw all of you walking around talking walkie-talkies all the time, which is, from his perspective as a World War II veteran, what a cell phone was a small walkie-talkie. So they knew about the cell phone revolution. We could see how maybe some people aligned with CIA bought some of the initial distributorships and so forth, and become famously wealthy and had built 50,000 square feet homes in Delta and Montrose County, Colorado. Okay, they knew about 9/11. We were at the La Hacienda restaurant in Albuquerque in 1973, that summer of 73, when we had jumped forward in time from fall of 71. My father received a call at the restaurant. We sped down to Socorro, New Mexico in about an hour, which meant he must have been going about 90 miles per hour because it's 90 miles south of Albuquerque. We parked, walked into that C-shaped building. Oh, by the way, that building I found during my second fact-finding trip to New Mexico in 2004 that Aerojet Corporation facility in Socorro, New Mexico was officially misidentified on the campus maps of New Mexico Tech, literally in their course, the map at the back of their course catalog, as Gibbons Hall, a student union of New Mexico Tech. And yet, I interviewed many people working in the research library there, and they said, oh no, that was an Aerojet Corporation facility. It was not only an Aerojet Corporation facility, the aerospace firm founded by Theodore von Karman in Pasadena, California. There again is the Pasadena connection. But it had a big sign on the front lawn that said Aerojet Corporation. Everybody remembered that. It was a big black granite sign with silver lettering. I remembered it because when we drove past it the first time, I asked my dad what a corporation was, which is, again, a seminal question for a future lawyer to be asking. But it definitely was an Aerojet facility. That's where they were processing images from the future. We were admitted into the left side of the building, into this room with about 20 TV monitors, and these young kind of physics graduate students. Well, we were met in the hall by somebody who in the movie has to be played by Ron Howard's brother, Clint. Because just like in Armageddon and the kinds of films where Clint Howard plays the hairy technician, he said, Ray, you've got to see it. We've got images of the domestic Pearl Harbor. You've got to see this footage. We've got the plane hitting the building and everything. So he lets us in this building, he pops this primitive beta videotape into a viewer, into a videotape console, and he says, watch this, Ray, and we see one of the planes come into view during 9/11, hit one of the Twin Towers, and explode in a fireball. And he and the other physics graduate student were like playing it back. It was about 18, 20 seconds long, like maybe they would have played back a slam dunk in the NBA Finals in their dorm room, okay? But they was just playing it back, and then the plane would hit the building, and they would go, bam, look at that. Because they're processing from the perspective of 1973, a terrorist attack in downtown Manhattan. I mean, we were all shocked when we saw it, but they were seeing it 18 years in advance. So 9/11, information about the 9/11 event did find its way in Defense Department files at that time, but what happened to that information? I don't know. I guess it's evidence that tends to suggest they let it happen, but maybe they're just guilty of malfeasance of office and it was just sitting in some locker in the Pentagon or something. But I do know that the project recovered information about 9/11 and that this domestic Pearl Harbor, as they perceived it, not this domestic Reichstag fire or inside job, was profoundly impacting to the country. And yet my dad was asked what happened after the attacks, and he said, well, the country picks itself up, dusts itself off, and goes on again like nothing happened. He was also asked about what was used to replace the Twin Towers, which just then in 71 and 73 were being completed in downtown Manhattan. And he said, he actually described that what they're building. He said there's a big building that they make that there's this huge spire that goes up like this. So I heard my father's account of that Freedom Tower that they're building at the 9/11 site in 1973 or even perhaps earlier. But it was being discussed in our presence, this domestic Pearl Harbor, which again from the perspective of World War II veterans. A major consequence or implication of the US government achieving quantum access by no later than 1970 is that they have been using time travel to identify future American presidents, approach them as young men. There may be a young woman. I don't have all the names of our future presidents, let's say in my lifetime. I think I know who one might be who's female. Apprise them of their destinies as president and presumably train them, or at least monitor them and at least allow them to know that they're destined for the White House so that the information can sink in. My information in this area? No. Rest assured it's not Sarah Palin. You can sleep well tonight. She's Palin by comparison to the woman I was thinking of. Okay. So we know that, I don't know about President Ford. Well, certainly Nixon was resigning. I have no information about Presidents Ford, who followed or preceded Jimmy Carter in office, nor President Ronald Reagan, who followed him in office. But we do know that they knew the identity of Jimmy Carter of Georgia as a future president later in the 1970s, elected, of course, in November of 1976, taking office on January 20th of 1977, because they had Alfred's seminal work about exopolitics, where he quotes President Carter in the front pages of that work. They now asked not only who is Alfred Lambermont Weber, but who is the lesser historical figure of James O. Carter. So they knew Jimmy Carter, who was then just governor of Georgia. He didn't have to be even lieutenant governor of Georgia to be an obscure political figure. It was either, they knew either that he was then governor or lieutenant governor, but his name came up and he was discussed. They knew the identities of President George Bush and his son George W. Bush. I know that because we had lunch with them around the time that they were briefed. His father was telling his son, and actually it was very much like the Dana Carvey's impression of George. He was going to say things like, "Not W, don't go there, don't talk about it at the table. We think that's what's going to happen, but just hold your fire. You know, John Adams and John Quincy Adams, it could happen again, but don't go there, W." But meanwhile, W was going around from table to table to the project people, going, he came right up to my face. It was like a, Alfred E. Newman in the flesh, and said, "Andy, have you heard my daddy not going to be president?" Okay, so both the Bushes knew because I had contact with them after they had been told. We also had a much more sedate lunch with Bill Clinton, my father, Harold Agnew, and Dr. Ivan Browning of the CIA, and that's when Clinton couldn't get his mind around the fact that he was destined to be president. And he was very young. So I think that may have been literally the first lunch I was at where one of these individuals had just been told, because Bill Clinton was still very thin, very Georgetown. So this may have been maybe pretty early in the game, but we sat over on the left side of one of the La Hacienda restaurant again there, and had a pretty quiet lunch. But what I remembered about young Bill Clinton is that he was just extremely good-natured and funny. He was basically the kind of person who's laughing at almost everything that's going on. At least that's what his personality was like as a 20-year-old, or however, whatever. Well, let's see, was he 20? Well, it could have been 1966. He was maybe about 25 also, 1970, 71. But he was real young and very, not particularly charismatic. I mean, he was just a college kid when we had that lunch. But he was briefed literally, again, by the project principals on Project Pegasus. They were running them through New Mexico and doing things like having these lunches where they were telling them, well, look, this is what we found, a window to the future. We can't tell you what it's like, but we know this. And at a certain time in the future, you're going to be president of the United States. So that's a heady thing to be told. And I think they decided to do this because you may recall that when Harry Truman told the story of that when he learned that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had died and that he was destined to become president, he said, "I felt like the entire weight of the world was being placed on my shoulders, and I was being driven into the ground." So I think that because their goal was survival and peace in the nuclear age, they thought, well, we don't want to tell persons of interest too much about their futures, but certainly in the case of the presidency, wouldn't it be better for them to psychologically adjust to their future destinies maybe 20, 25 years in advance? Well, that's the decision they made. Of course, W didn't do any good, but no. So W was very animated, and he did become a little bit calmer in adulthood, but he also had been briefed. Now, you may recall that one of our greatest television investigative journalists, Dan Rather, went in search of where George W. Bush was in 1973. He wasn't at his Texas Air National Guard unit. He wasn't in Alabama or Mississippi working for any of his father's friends' congressional races. When Dan started to get close to where he was, which I believe he was in seminar being trained for the presidency, we know what happened, which is they took Dan's anchor desk away from CBS News, and he was put through that entirely unfair, humiliating exercise of having to admit that he was deceived by false records and so forth regarding where W was in 73. And I want to meet Dan and talk to him about the fact that he was right on the razor's edge of uncovering the linkage between the presidency and quantum access, and that in all likelihood in 1973, George Walker Bush was being trained for the presidency, because I know in the early 70s, as his father was, he was briefed about his future presidency. Now people say, wait a minute, I see something inconsistent here in your analysis, Andy. You're saying that the chronovisors were giving you different slices of the quantum hologram, and every time they sent you to the Lincoln assassination site, at least from your perspective, it changed a little bit. How could they predict to a certainty who was going to be president? Well, the answer is they were using multiple time travel techniques. And for example, when you teleport to the future physically. That's just like moving from room to room, from segment to segment of the timeline. And as long as you don't deviate and leave the timeline, you're able to stand there and see that George W. Bush is being sworn in as president on a certain day. So when I talk about the multiverse exists, but we have time travel that can both sample alternate timelines in the multiverse and also identify to a dispositive certainty what happened on a particular timeline in the past and what will happen on a particular timeline in the future. So the significance of this linkage between quantum access and the US presidency, it's essentially an object lesson in the fact that they can identify to a dispositive certainty the actual destiny of a particular person. Not just with psychics. Courtney Hunt of the CIA, my contact officer at the CIA, once said, you won't believe the kind of psychics they had. They could look at a list of 500 names, French-Canadian schoolchildren, and pull out the name Celine Dion, right? They were that good at their ability to predict future events, future persons of interest. But what I'm saying is that in the totality of their involvement in time travel, the US intelligence community has evolved a predictive capability. And that means that they know whether or not Sarah Palin is ever going to be president before she runs. But what they've been doing is approaching the winners and apprising them of their destinies. I know that regarding Barack Obama for two reasons. When we were in the Mars training course up at College of the Siskiyous in summer of 1980, sitting in the front was a young Regina Dugan, who is now the director of DARPA. Barry Soetoro, as he identified himself to me from Hawaii, was sitting over in the middle center of the desks. And then usually I was sitting in the middle back, my father behind me. William Brett Stillings, one of my contemporaries, was over on my right. And Tom Stillings of Lockheed was behind his son Brett. So Barry was often a couple seats in front of Brett. One day there was a break in class, and Barry Soetoro, now Barack Obama, got up to talk to the instructor, Ed Dames. And Brett stood up. I may have gotten up and stretched as well. It was kind of a break in the action in the class. And Tom Stillings, Brett's father, leaned into this little tea party, 4 desks of myself, Brett, my father, and Tom Stillings, and said, how do you feel about being in a program like this about Mars, Brett, with a future American president? And referring to a young Barack Obama. And before he could answer, my father leaned into the aisle and, gesturing like this with 2 fingers, said, 2 presidents. So we don't know whether he was referring to me or Regina Dugan or somebody else in the room. So in fact, the significance of my account of being in that Mars training group with that group of 10 teenagers is that according to my father, who was at that point senior CIA, he had been consulting the CIA since 1952. This is now 1980. What is that, 28 years? He knew that there was a second president in the room in addition to Barry Soetoro. How they knew that? They knew that because the identities of future presidents were entering the intelligence reports containing forward intelligence that they were privy to. At least my father had more years in CIA and had been more part of the development of time travel technology. So he knew that 2 of the 10 kids, and there were about maybe 6 or 7 fathers. I do remember meeting Stanley Ann Dunham at the dinner that was held at the end of the course. She came over and was sitting next to her son when we were sitting communally at a table in the Creamery restaurant there in Weed, right up a stone's throw in those years from the college. But Brett has reported how on the way back to the hotel after that class, his father kept on repeating, what are the chances? How could they have decided to put 2 future presidents in the same training course, Brett? Well, Regina is now the first female ever to reach the directorship of DARPA. And I believe that Brett is actually the developer or the evolver of chronovision, because during one of the components of the curriculum that I was on, I saw the name William Stillings linked to the word chronovision. So Brett is now actively trying to independently develop chronovision. And he has made major strides and probably will do so. He understands the electro-optical effects with bismuth crystal that you would need to do to propagate an extremely dense hologram. So the mystery of that class is, why did they create an enrichment among 10 kids, knowing that 2 of them, whether it's Regina or myself being the second one, were future American presidents? But this again is the high strangeness with which the CIA was working with young people during those years. This is speculative, but I believe that the birther controversy, the question of whether or not President Obama was born here in Hawaii or in Kenya or some other place, was probably propagated by the Obama administration itself to limit the ambit of potential discussion about his true past. Because what we do know about President Obama is he's multi-generational CIA, and at least in terms of being in that Mars seminar in 1980, he was being developed by the CIA as a young man. I crossed paths with Barry Soetoro about 2 years later in West Los Angeles in the home of an anti-apartheid activist from South Africa. He was then taller, thinner, more confident, a better listener. Brett and I had remembered that back in summer of '80, in the Mars course at the College of the Siskiyous, every time we would either discuss something completely new or something that Ed Dames had told us, Barack's response was, "Oh, I know that, man. No, I know that." He was always like refusing to acknowledge that we could share anything with him that he would learn from. But then when I met him 2 years later in West LA, he was quiet, he was listening to what I was saying, we were having kind of a debate about the significance of the transnational corporations. He introduced himself as Barack Obama, so the name change had to occur in those 2 years when he transferred after 2 years at Occidental College over to Columbia University in New York. So there really is a mystery here about this individual. We know he was multi-generational CIA. We know he was in some of the defense technical activities I was in. But we don't even know if he's actually the biological son of Barack Obama Sr. That may literally be a legend that was scripted after he was trained for Mars and he was brought into CIA operations in 1981. We do know to a fair certainty that he traveled to Pakistan in 1981 on his Indonesian passport at a time when it was illegal for Americans to do so because there was a travel ban that had been imposed by the Secretary of State. So we liked Barry. He was bright. He was friendly. He was just a very likable young man, and so I have no umbrage. I mean, as I said, I voted for him. I think he's a fine person. I just think that he has to come clean, as Ed Dames does, as Bill Richardson does, and as Donald Rumsfeld and these other apparatchiks, because we now have to begin sharing our secret experiences with the American people, basically because it's right. We shouldn't, America should be about the truth. That's the bottom line. And I think that when he leaves the White House and writes his memoir, I hope he includes the fact that he was groomed at least in the Mars program. The question is, Brett and I went up there via jump room. We don't know whether Barack Obama or Regina Dugan did. If they didn't, it looks like those who weren't sent were groomed for political leadership. And those of us who did go up and serve our country on Mars were basically tossed to the wolves. So I do hope to reach the White House. From my perspective, I hope someday that Barack Obama will observe that President Andrew D. Bashaga was in his Mars training class at College of the Siskiyous in Weed, California. But we'll see if that happens. Okay, so what public policy choices confront us? Time travel technology emerged in the U.S. defense community over 40 years ago. It was being used to place U.S. personnel on Mars over 30 years ago. We have multiple informants who are now coming forward to corroborate each other on that. It holds one of the major keys to resolving the crisis of environment and development in the 21st century. You may know in California that every time a lane is added to a freeway, it fills up in a month, and another one has to, a new bond measure has to be passed to fund another freeway lane or overpass or underpass. Conventional propulsive transportation is already outmoded. It's not going to fail us in the future. It's already failed us when, the average person is sleeping 8 hours a day, and that leaves them 16 hours to do everything else in their life. If they're in traffic, 2 hours to work and 2 hours home, that's 4 hours of the 16 hours. That's 25% of the time they have awake to sit in traffic, spewing greenhouse gases, and getting diabetes, heart disease, and cancer. This crisis of diabesity, the linkage between diabetes, obesity, and heart disease that the American adult population is succumbing to now that our obesity rate has reached 70% among adults. Okay, so we have to find a way to liberate people from their automobiles. I believe that is going to be in perfecting and implementing Tesla teleportation. We also have this constitutional and political controversy, crisis on the presidency, if you will, surrounding the fact that clearly the framers of the U.S. Constitution, nor the American people, the framers could not contemplate, nor can the American people understand, that when the winners of the presidential race announce, as you saw Bush, Clinton, and Obama, remember when they announced how confident they were? I don't think that was just confidence. I think that was winner's confidence. They were buoyant. Barack Obama's announcement in Chicago was almost like his acceptance of the presidential general election victory. It was a celebration. It wasn't a modest announcement. If you go back and you review the films also, when Bill Clinton announced and when George W. Bush announced, these three baby boomer, change agent presidents, they knew they were going to win, and they were flying high when they announced. Well, that doesn't affirm what the great David Icke has said of the American presidency, which is that our presidents are not elected by ballot, but selected by blood. But it does constitute an unfair advantage for the winners. When everybody runs for president, regardless of their background, I think it should be an even playing field. The winners shouldn't know that they're going to win. So even if this continues to be done, it's not something that should be shared with the winners. And we do have this evidence that it was shared with, now I don't know about Carter, but certainly it was shared with Bush, Clinton, Bush, and Obama, and it should end. Was I told directly that I would reach the White House? I was told in a kind of a mealy-mouthed way by Courtney Hunt, and I think if I do reach the White House, they're not going to sit me down and brief me because I'm the guy that upsets their apple cart and reveals to the American people that they've been doing this with quantum access. They've been undermining the legitimacy, the purity of the presidency. So we'll see. I don't have any prior knowledge beyond my father's comment, and Courtney's saying, the first time I asked him, do I become president? He said, yes, but I don't know how you get there. The second time he said, he must have consulted back with CIA and said, Andy's asking questions. The second time he said, no, but you're on the scene, which presumably I run and don't win. And then the third time I asked him and he said, have you been briefed on 2015? So I think it's going to be interesting whichever way it plays out. The bottom line, though, on time travel technology is even wider than its impact in undermining the sanctity, the integrity of the presidency, or at least the presidential selection process. The bottom line is that it remains secret and it's viewed as speculative by the public. And so, for example, when people who don't have access to the information, let's say a Michio Kaku, begin pontificating about where time travel is or where it will later be in the future or will not be, the bottom line is that even leading scientists and graduate physics students at our leading universities don't have access to these scientific papers, these records. And so they can't participate in the evolution of society. And so we're really retarding society by keeping time travel secret. And if we continue to do so, really, you heard the phrase stuck in the 70s? We're really keeping the technical infrastructure of the 21st century stuck in the 20th century, in the 70s, which is basically gridlock on our automobile transport systems and in our airports, at least a lot of congestion in our airports. So what am I proposing that we do? I'm proposing that we make teleportation a public transport technology rather than keep it a secret weapon of war. Because that, in fact, is how it has been captured and kept secret and sequestered by the U.S. defense community since the death of Tesla in 1943. The opportunity presented by teleportation, obviously, that if it's made public, teleportation will revolutionize transport in the 21st century by enabling us to move at first between major world cities in seconds. So the example that I cite is imagine jumping through a teleport at Grand Central Teleport in New York City and arriving at Union Teleport in Los Angeles in several seconds. This kind of experience as a traveler was not just theoretically possible, but practically possible in 1970. What are the constraints? Well, the constraints are that teleportation will remain an instrument of war, with the net effect that we will see some of the resource wars that we could have prevented, like all of the conflict we've seen in the Middle East where our petroleum reserves are. A lot of that could have been prevented if we had introduced the new energy paradigm that would focus, at least in the transportation sector, on teleportation. So if we don't introduce teleportation and we keep it as a secretive weapon of war, We may literally have the wars that otherwise could have been prevented if we had introduced this technology that does so more with so less. As Buckminster Fuller used to say, teleportation is a living technology. It promotes, it advantages human life rather than killingry, rather than weaponry. And so I think we're under a moral obligation now to introduce it, now that it's been available for 40 years, to move people from point A to point B. What are the opportunities and constraints of chronovision? Well, I think it's pretty apparent that it's either going to be looking glass technology, in which we can all look into the past, or it's going to be looking at technology, in which a tyrannical government subjects us to 24-hour state surveillance using technical remote viewing. Is that an idle fear? No. As Alfred mentioned, during the administration of George W. Bush, President Bush the Younger appointed Admiral John Poindexter of the Iran-Contra scandal to head up a sub-project or project under DARPA again called Total Information Awareness. And that was providing the US government total information awareness. Information about individuals gleaned on Facebook, information on demographic trends and people's interests when they place a search on Google, and these other large, secretly federally funded software platforms on the internet. It also obviously would involve the kind of potential surveillance of individuals and groups that was depicted in the featured film Deja Vu with Denzel Washington, where they had actually now digitized chronovision, where they weren't opening up these big holograms in the laboratory, but they had basically made it more compact and modular and could just hit some keystrokes on their computer and pull up images, not of what somebody is doing in their bathroom or bedroom or wherever, robbing a bank or whatever, in real time, but what they did in their bedroom or bathroom 5 years ago and what they will be doing in their bedroom, their bathroom, or some bank they're robbing 5 years in the future. The goal of DARPA under Total Information Awareness was to create a 24-hour surveillance state where no fact about any person or group would ever be concealed from the snooping eyes of government. If we don't increase public awareness about chronovision and the fact that it secretly emerged in the US defense technical community 40 years ago, we may literally find ourselves living in an Orwellian democracy where we cannot escape the snooping eyes of the government. Look at what has already happened in the United Kingdom, in Britain, where there's a surveillance camera on every street corner. I don't think any of us shares that vision of America, or even Britain, for that matter. As free human beings, we have the right to privacy and to not constantly be surveilled by government employees earning their salary from our tax dollars, who are then tasked to surveil us because we might possess dissident beliefs, we might evince deviant behaviors, or we might be persons of interest in some political, criminal, or industrial way or whatever. It's simply not consistent with any humane and principled vision of human life to believe that some of us should be surveilling the rest of us all day long. And that's what chronovision potentially brings about. I believe that that's what they meant by total information awareness. Clearly, Admiral Poindexter is not known for being one of the warm and fuzzy people in government. He's a real serious, hardcore, authoritarian naval officer. And I think we saw the beginnings there of that 24-hour surveillance state that we want to resist as a collective country and as a collective humanity. The broader issue, obviously, that's the constraint of chronovision. I forgot to mention the benefit of chronovision. Imagine that you could take your class of grammar school students to the National Archive, or even to a state or local library or museum, and they could see things like, well, this is back, hold on, let me go back to chronovision. That you could take them to a quantum or virtual, well, I would call it a quantum museum, let's say, a virtual library. And there they could see dinosaurs as they actually looked during their existence. They could see William Shakespeare actually writing one of his plays and say, well, here's where Shakespeare was when he was writing Romeo and Juliet, and this is what his room looked like, and here's what Francis Bacon or William Shakespeare, or whoever the guy really was, looked like when he was writing Macbeth or whatever. or even Washington crossing the Delaware. You could even use this to show people elements of their own past, like being born, or when they did something very special, something beautiful, and reinforce people's humanity that way, to cultivate their humanity. So chronovision has a positive dimension, but obviously it would have to be by using it on a public limited access basis, because the alternative would be the loss of everybody's privacy. Okay, so there we have chronovision, teleportation. Quantum access, why do we want to get a handle on this? Because we want to be perpetuated in a society characterized by government by the consent of the governed, rather than government by the deceit of the governing. What we've had in the area of the emergence of time travel technology is 40 years of profound deceit by the government, constantly lying to the American people, constantly putting films out that misportray the history of time travel, putting agent provocateurs, for example, in my life, where I maintain a community of 5,000 Facebook friends, and they invent personas sometimes to drop into my Facebook and start defaming me or whatever. Okay, our tax dollars should not be used to deceive us, to conceal us, and to lie to us about our actual technical history as a civilization. The United States we're a great people, a generous people, a creative people, and we want to liberate quantum access for public use because it's more important than government itself. So what's my 5-year agenda? Just in closing, my 5-year agenda is to sustain my truth campaign about the secret U.S. achievement of time travel and Mars visitation. It's to continue to share my experiences in Project Pegasus and going up to Mars in both the mainstream and the alternative media, and whether I win or not, whether they knew in advance or not, it's to run for president in 2016 to accomplish these things and other things on behalf of the American people. So I'd be happy to open up the floor for any questions.
Are you on record? Is this your announcement?
No, but I'm running.
Okay.
I only have to get over my cough. Bill Clinton had allergies, so I'm in good company. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, you mentioned about you and other people having metabolic disorders and heart problems from time travel. So,
yes.
Do you think that this, or your hope is that that will be worked out?
I think it has been.
It has been already?
The heart valve defects and the metabolic disruption. The heart valve defects were linked to teleportation by Courtney Hunt to the CIA. The heart valve defects. The metabolic disruption was linked to the teleportation again by Jack Pruitt when I met him in Santa Fe in 2003. So if they have worked for 40 years with teleportation, they may have already made it safe. I was being given this big horse pill, as my dad called it, to counteract the effects of the teleportation on my metabolic function when I was in the program. The dehydration upon arriving in Santa Fe was so severe that prior to that meet and greet that I described with Donald Rumsfeld in Cerrillos with 20 kids from the project, where he was talking about project secrecy and so forth, the military significance of teleportation, we were lining up in the water fountain in the hallway, and one of the kids actually pulled the child in front of him away to get to the water fountain. So we were almost experiencing something like hydrophobia, when you have rabies. We were profoundly dehydrated upon arriving in New Mexico. And Rumsfeld mentioned how, the natural environment of New Mexico is by its very nature very arid. So we were dehydrated in a dehydrating environment. So hopefully they worked it out by then. But if they haven't, if we can put people on the moon and jump room them to Mars, we can make teleportation medically safe, I'm sure. Sir? Ma'am, excuse me.
Okay, okay, so if Mars is not all that wonderful to live on, like Hawaii, okay, why wouldn't all the Martians come over here then?
I think that some are here. I mentioned on Coast that if the average Martian that's linked to us genetically, there was there's been a colony on Mars of Martians. And in fact, when Alfred published my paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, at exopolitics.com in late December of 2008, I received a telephone call 4 days later from Virginia Olds of the CIA, who was one of the DARPA psychologists that worked with me when I was a child on Project Pegasus. And she said, Andrew, your paper is just right on target, and in fact, there's an indigenous population of 1 million Martians, and they live primarily underground, and there are several humanoid types, which we've now identified in our images. That population of indigenous Martians may very well be our genetic cousins. let's say, the descendants of the Earthlings that were on Mars when that solar system catastrophe occurred in 9500 BC. We think it may have been debris elements from the Vela supernova explosion entering our solar system and hitting Mars, fracturing it. Mars became kind of an oblate spheroid, more oblate than Earth, more like an apple shape than a sphere. But Earth was also devastated by that. I mean, look at the two Hopi creation myths, Dragon Slayer and Born of Water. Well, when you have a lot of debris falling in the ocean, you tend to get flooded, right? Hence maybe the biblical and the Epic of Gilgamesh flood legends, flood accounts. So we don't know the exact identity of that indigenous population of Martians. They're either like us because they evolved on a planet close to us, or they're like us because we have common ancestry. I'm not talking about the Earthling colony now on Mars. I'm talking about their indigenous population. Now, the three that I'm going to be talking about this on Thursday, but the three that I met in 1970 at Curtis Wright, basically, as I described, they were bald, ugly white guys. I mean, two looked like Mr. Clean, Telly Savalas, Patrick Stewart, and the guy in the middle looked like Larry from the Three Stooges. So, as I said, if not the Martians who are sort of gray ET-like, but the ones that are truly our genetic cousins, if they had been dressed in Armani suits and walked down Madison Avenue in New York City, nobody would have been able to tell if they were from another planet. So we know from Courtney Brown's work that there's a colony of Martians in the mountains near Santa Fe. That, of course, the Charles Hall's testimony indicates that they're actually the tall whites out there. But there would be no problem mainstreaming Martians that are related to us in our population because they are us. In fact, after 11,500 years of genetic lack of consanguinity with us, they may even be able to interbreed with humans because they are Homo sapiens sapiens, just Homo sapiens marinus. So I think that they probably are among us, and I hope that they respect my truth campaign because I am trying to normalize relations between Mars and Earth, as Alfred has been doing, for example, as he does in Exopolitics, where he presents basically a public policy model for integration of Earth and Mars exopolitically and socially and so forth. Yes, sir?
Has there ever been an attempt to change history? Like I read a sci-fi short story about trying to kill Hitler before he rose to power.
Well, if it didn't happen in real time during that historical epoch, then that party didn't time travel from the future to intervene in the present, right?
Well,
so
then the whole timeline that we might be in now might be erased or something like that.
No, there's no magical erasure. If you do go back, you usually only have a range of freedom to, at best, fulfill an event. Like I went back and my presence was manifest in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania in 1863, the day Lincoln was there. There wasn't an original event where I wasn't there and I wasn't photographed and then I was superimposed from the future, because when I was sent from the future to November 19th of 1863, I was there. Okay, so when you time travel to the past to affect the past, the effects that you have and their causal linkages to the future occur in the present. So one of the great mistaken paradoxes, one of the great ideas that is actually a mistaken idea that represents confusion about time travel, is that when you go back to the past to change the future, you do it in the present, and you've already affected the future you left. You don't create a second event and hence a second set of causal relationships to the future. I mean, the Schrodinger's cat example varies from my interpretation because they say when you go back and, like I went back and got photographed in Gettysburg, there was the Gettysburg event that didn't include me in that photograph, and then there was the timeline that broke off when I did. But that doesn't make sense because when you time travel to the past to affect a past event, you do so in the future. You do it in real time, and it links forward naturally. Just as my photograph linked forward in time was ultimately discovered in 1951, 10 years before my birth. Ma'am?
Were all the children involved from military families, and why do not more people have memory of participating? Was something done to...
In fact, Brett and I have remembered and have tracked many things about our Mars training program and going up to Mars. We want to know what the President of the United States and the Director of DARPA do.
Right.
That's fraught with implications.
Right.
The selection criteria were under Project Talent. There's been a discussion by Duncan O'Finian and James Casbolt, whose actual name is what, Michael Prince, about Project Talent. And they've talked about the super soldier program and being trained for political assassinations and that type of thing. Those kinds of programs have existed. But the original Project Talent was launched by Admiral Hyman Rickover, who wanted to produce better plebes at the Naval Academy that he could train to become captains of nuclear submarines. Because those nuclear submarines contain, for example, one Trident submarine contains as much explosive capability as would be produced if a Hiroshima-sized blast was blown up every day for 13 years. So Rickover was looking at that and thinking, wait a minute, if we have one Captain Queeg here, one person who cracks under pressure, they could lob a thermonuclear missile into Moscow and it would all be over for all of us. So he launched Project Talent to start identifying young Americans of outstanding leadership ability, intelligence, and intuition, which is a part of the cadre of leadership that they wanted to create. So those were some of the basic criteria. Certainly having a father or a mother in the intelligence community, the defense community, the military, helped because in a sense those families were volunteering their children into such enterprises. That's not why I was selected, but it certainly might be the reason, let's say, a young Barry Soetoro was with a mother at AID who was CIA. So I think that the selection criteria were sort of both personal and social. There was kind of an overlay of what the kid brought to the equation and then the overlay of who their parent was that was connected to the military, the intelligence community, the Defense Department, defense contractors, your big aerospace companies and so forth. I mean, they even knew that the children of the astronauts were almost all having contacts with extraterrestrials. So they were dealing in a very urgent post-war environment. I don't want to say what astronaut family that I got that from, but they were dealing with the intense Cold War pressures of not knowing what the Greys wanted and the Reds, the extraterrestrials, and then the Soviet Union. Why more people don't remember? Well, what I found in my now 12-year investigation is that a small group of human beings have brilliant memories. For example, somebody like Prime Minister Nehru of India, who was, while imprisoned by the British, wrote his book, Glimpses of World History from Memory. Just take a look at that book next time you're in a university library. It's very detailed. So some people are just superb rememberers. And he was accurate on all the birth dates and historical dates and people, the spelling of people's names and that type of thing. Then I found that about 10%, when you do field investigation, about 10% of experiencers are going to give you good information. Oh yeah, I remember that you were in class, yeah. We sat in this chair and you saw a little bit of your future, whatever, okay. That's how some of my co-participants kind of remembered what happened, but it's kind of glib, kind of superficial. But the primary thing I learned about human memory is that most people have no memory. They're almost living entirely in the present. That sounds kind of critical of people, but I'm just saying that most people have pretty bad memories. I think it's maybe because of the complexity of modern life, how much information we're all processing on a daily basis. I mean, I had people who couldn't even name correctly the names of our teachers. Like, you were sitting in their class for a year as a kid, and you couldn't remember that it was Mrs. Easton, not Mrs. Eason, that it was Mr. Fanek, not Mr. Stefancic. It was that bad. I found that most people had terrible memories. And in that sense, those of us who have had non-ordinary experiences of either parapolitical nature or paranormal nature, we have to forgive ourselves and stick to our memories, because why subjugate our memories to the bad rememberers? If you know something happened to you and you remember it, hold your guns, because most people are bad rememberers. That's what I learned in my investigation about memory. You're welcome. Dana?
Kind of a two-part question. Is the future, or are future events in one's life certain or predetermined, or are they just potentials? And for you, like just seeing yourself in certain future situations, like when you said you became a trial lawyer in Seattle and you had no idea of that, did that, or when you saw the book that you were to one day edit? Or
Alfred's book, and also my own book. I wasn't allowed to read those books, but it was clear to me that I had edited Alfred's book, Exopolitics, and Dad and Connie and some of the project people were reading my memoir of the project. That's why they began to scrutinize me in the beginning of the summer of '71 as the future whistleblower.
So did knowing about such things influence you to say, oh, I better go and become a trial lawyer in Seattle, or?
Possibly there was some quantum entanglement from having seen it time traveling, so that I then ultimately decided to apply to law school and take the LSAT and everything and go to law school. It's possible that that's one of the dangers of sharing information about somebody's discrete future with them, is they're getting that information in real time, and you're actually potentially skewering their destiny. There's actually a selection pressure on their choice making because they've been told, it's just like when parents brainwash their child to be a doctor or something. They don't know why they want to be a doctor at 22, they just have heard it 500 times. So if you share information with somebody about their future, you're likely to either make them pursue it more ardently or intimidate them into not pursuing it. Just when somebody finally says, no, Dad, I don't want to be a doctor. So it does have impacts, and in fact, their policy was to hold back as much information from people as possible. In other words, it was considered sensitive on a programmatic basis to share information about somebody's future destiny or life with them in real time as a result of it being accessed from the future. This pattern of apprising future American presidents was an extreme exception to the really scrupulous regime that they were keeping in place. For example, my father came back to the La Hacienda restaurant one afternoon after he had been at a meeting, a project meeting, and Connie had kind of been, babysitting me. I was kind of hanging out in the restaurant where she worked. And my dad was deeply disturbed about something. I think he had just been told that the teleportees from Project Pegasus, at least some of them, were going to be heading to Mars, or that I in particular was going to be. And Connie blurted out, Ray, is this before or after Andy finds all those creatures up on Mars? And my dad looked at her in an alarmed way and scowled at her, because that was not a future data point. That at that point, that must have been before the fall of 71, because then in the fall of 71 I was permitted to read my paper. But that was then therefore before then, and at that point, nobody had been authorized to explain to me that in the future I would have this relationship with Mars. Going up there and then later finding humanoids and animals in NASA's images and trying to prove the case of life on Mars. So the overwhelming regime that was in place was to not share information about somebody's future with them so as to not divert it.